Welcome students, to our video on drug classifications. Today, we will dive into the fascinating world of drugs, understanding how they are categorized, and why it is important to do so. So, sit back and let's get started. Let's begin by learning the basic definition of drug class. A drug class is a term used to describe medications that are grouped together because of their similarity. Now, we will discuss what is the aim of drug classification. The objective of drug classification is to ensure that a drug is used safely to achieve the maximum benefit. In the long run, when a drug is taken, the body chemistry is changed. While this effect is meant to be therapeutic, it can also cause side effects that may be harmful. Furthermore, if multiple drugs are taken, the body chemistry may be altered in such a way that a drug is far less effective, or the side effects are far more severe. By remarking the classification of a drug, a physician can have a better understanding of what to expect when the patient takes it, what the risks are, and which drugs a patient can switch to, if desired. This description also aids the identification of drug-drug interactions, and the possibility for drug resistance, and make the right staging of treatment certain. We will talk about them in succession. The efficacy of a drug can often be lowered if the action of one drug reduces the action of another. As drugs are generally categorized by their mode and mechanism of action, any interaction affecting one drug will usually impinge on drugs of the same class, either by intervening with their absorption or the way in which the body metabolizes the drug. For example, antacids act by blocking stomach acid. This acid is needed to break down and absorb a class of HIV drug, known as protease inhibitors. If the medications are taken together, the HIV drug will be less able to control the viral infection. Likewise, many classes of drug are cleared from the body by a liver enzyme called CYP3A4. If two drugs are taken, and each of them is metabolized by this enzyme, the drugs may not be cleared as effectively, and begin to build up, leading to toxicity. By understanding the classification of a drug by CYP3A4 action, healthcare professionals are better able to prevent this interaction. The same applies to drugs, like methotrexate and Advil, that are metabolized by the kidneys. Their concurrent use may not only lead to toxicity, but kidney failure. Other classes of the drug need to be used with caution when combined with those that affect the same organ system. For example, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or NSAIDs, like Motrin or aspirin, are often avoided when taking anticoagulants or blood thinners like warfarin, as the former can increase the risk of bleeding, while the latter inhibits the clotting of blood. It is for this same reason that two NSAIDs are not combined. In some cases, doubling the class of drug only serves to double the risk or severity of the side effects. Medications utilized to treat chronic infections do so in a certain manner. If used inaccurately, or for a long interval of time, a drug may lose its potency as the infection becomes resistant to its effects. If this happens, other drugs of the same class may also fail or not work out too. Antibiotics, of which there are 9 major classes, and HIV drugs, of which there are 6 classes, are 2 such cases. Reliant on the class, some may have a more potential for resistance than others. To better prevail over resistance, multiple classes are usually prescribed to attain optimum management of the bacterial or viral infection. Drugs are often staged so that patients are first exposed to over-the-counter drugs with the fewest side effects, and then shifted to prescription choices that have more severe side effects. The drugs are every so often staged by the class under a specified standard, with preferred classes used for first-line therapies and alternate classes used for subsequent therapies. For example, for the treatment of severe pain, physicians mostly use over-the-counter NSAIDs first and prescription NSAIDs second, before moving on to highly addictive Schedule II opioid drugs, like OxyContin or oxycodone, and Vicodin or hydrocodone. Drug staging is also essential for the treatment of chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD, and autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis. In cases like these, the class of drug usually instructs the suitable staging of treatment. Drugs are classified in accordance with various benchmarks, reliant on the group doing the classification and the rationale for classification. Such as, from a therapeutic perspective, a drug might be categorized by the way it is used to treat ailment. Other classification systems might classify drugs by active ingredients or chemical composition. Based on these distinct classification practices, some drugs may be clustered together under one system, but not another. In other cases, a drug may have numerous uses or actions and may be incorporated in multiple drug classes within a separate classification system. For example, drug finasteride, which is used to treat an enlarged prostate or to regrow hair, and may be integrated in multiple drug classes within a single classification system. This doesn't even take into consideration the drugs that are utilized off-label for purposes other than what they were approved for. A key illustration is levothyroxine, which is approved to treat hypothyroidism or low thyroid function, but is often used off-label to treat depression. In a nutshell, there are several approaches to categorize a drug, and thousands of distinct drug classes and subclasses. We will discuss some of these briefly. The first one is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that is FFDCA, was passed in 1938 to help out in determining what drugs would be approved for certain uses. The FFDCA gave the Food and Drug Administration, that is FDA, the authority to ascertain the safety of numerous food products, medicinal drugs, and cosmetics in the United States. The Act has been revised a number of times to permit for concerns that are used to scrutinize the efficacy of drugs, or to integrate new sorts of concerns or evidence, such as researches for bioterrorism, and for other policies involving additional advancements in the production of drugs. The FFDCA deals with medicinal drugs, or drugs that are designed to treat, prevent, and cure, or that are utilized in the diagnosis of illnesses or diseases in people or animals. Medicinal drugs are classified into two major categories. Prescription drugs that can only be dispensed with a written prescription from a qualified healthcare professional, such as a physician, dentist, etc. For example, Vicodin for pain control. Over-the-counter drugs that do not need a written prescription in order to be purchased, for example, Tylenol for pain control. Alongside them, the FFCDA makes a further designation between chemical compound drugs and biologic drugs. Chemical compounds are drugs that are manufactured by combining specific chemicals in fixed proportions. These are the drugs that most of the big pharmaceutical businesses market. They are often further broken down into brand name drugs. They are patented and can only be manufactured and distributed by the company that holds the patent, such as Tylenol. Generic drugs are basically of the same composition, but manufactured by different companies under different names. Often generic drugs are less pricey than the brand name additions, such as acetaminophen, which is generic for Tylenol. Unlike chemical drugs, biologics are manufactured in some type of a living organism or living system, such as a plant, animal, or even in a microorganism, like a bacterium. They are composed of a comprehensive collection of various therapeutic products, such as vaccines, gene therapy materials, recombinant therapeutic proteins, and so forth. These products need very stringent regulations, as they are extremely sensitive to environmental fluctuations, and even the slightest variation in the circumstances under which they are manufactured can affect their composition. Under this category, there are Patented biologics can be manufactured and marketed only by the company holding the patent. Biosimilars are basically generic forms of biologics. These are rare because it is challenging for a firm to create a biosimilar drug which is equivalent to the original biologic in terms of its effectiveness and composition. The first recognized biosimilar drug in the United States was approved by the FDA in March 2015. Next one is ATC classification system. In 1976, the World Health Organization, that is WHO, created a multidimensional system called the Anatomical Therapeutic Chemical, or ATC classification system, which categorizes a drug based on 5 levels. Level 1 describes the organ system the drug treats. Level 2 describes the drug's therapeutic effect. Level 3 describes the mechanism or mode of action. Level 4 describes the general chemical properties of the drug. Level 5 describes the chemical components that make up the drug, essentially the chemical name of the drug, such as finasteride or ibuprofen. For each level, either a letter or numbers are allocated. While not beneficial for the consumer, the ATC system is able to categorize the active ingredient of a drug under a strict chain of command, so that it is correctly used and not confused for another drug. The next classification system that we are going to talk about is USP drug classification. In the United States, a non-profit, non-governmental organization, named as the United States Pharmacopoeia, that is USP, was established in 1820 to certify that prescription and over-the-counter drugs permitted for usage in the United States meet quality standards in order to be positioned on the national formulary issued by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Globally, there are 34 other countries that maintain national pharmacopoeias, as well as a European Union pharmacopoeia for European countries that don't maintain their own pharmacopoeia. Other countries typically depend on the International Pharmacopoeia, maintained by the WHO. The USP classifies drugs in a far clearer way than the ATC system, categorizing a drug, firstly, on its therapeutic use, secondly, on its mechanism or mode of action, and, thirdly, on its formulary classification. Even with this simplified system, there are still loads of diverse drug classes and thousands of different subclasses and subcategories. From the broadest viewpoint, the USP presently classifies a drug or drug component under one of 49 different therapeutic classes. Analgesics, including opioids and non-opioids. Anesthetics. Antibacterials, including antibiotics. Anticonvulsants. Antidementia agents. Antidepressants. Antidotes, and antitoxins. Antiemetics. Antifungals. Anti-inflammatory agents, including corticosteroids, and nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs. Anti-migraine agents. Anti-myasthenic agents. Antimycobacterials. Antineoplastics. Antiparasitics. Anti-Parkinson agents. Antipsychotics. Antivirals, including HIV antiretrovirals, and direct-acting hepatitis C drugs. Anxiolytic agents. Bipolar agents, blood glucose regulators, including insulin, and other diabetes medications. Blood products, including anticoagulants. Cardiovascular agents, including beta blockers, and ACE inhibitors. Central nervous system agents, including amphetamines. Dental and oral agents. Dermatological agents. Enzyme replacement agents. Gastrointestinal agents, including H2 blockers, and proton pump inhibitors. Genitourinary agents. Hormonal agents, adrenal. Hormonal agents, pituitary. Hormonal agents, prostaglandins. Hormonal agents, sex hormones, including estrogen, testosterone, and anabolic steroids. Hormonal agents, thyroid. Hormone suppressant, adrenal. Hormone suppressant, parathyroid. Hormone suppressant, pituitary. Hormone suppressant, sex hormones. Hormone suppressant, thyroid. Immunological agents, including vaccines, and disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs or DMARDs. Inflammatory bowel disease agents. Metabolic bone disease agents. Ophthalmic agents. Otic agents. Respiratory tract agents, including antihistamines, and bronchodilators. Sedatives, and hypnotics. Skeletal muscle relaxants. Therapeutic nutrients, minerals, and electrolyte. Classification, that we are going to consider, next off is, Pharmaceutical Classification System. The term, Pharmaceutical Classification Systems, refer to, a number of drug classification procedures, that classify drugs, corresponding to their chemical composition, mechanism of action, or therapeutic intent. When drugs are classed, by their mechanism of action, or therapeutic effects, specific drugs may be positioned, in more than one group. This results in, a significant number of, prospective classes of drugs. For example, antidepressant drugs, are principally used, for the treatment of clinical depression, even though, they have other uses too. Antidepressant drugs, are also classified, according to their mechanism of action. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, such as Prozac, or Paxil, are predominantly antidepressant drugs, that act on, the neurotransmitter serotonin. Whereas tricyclic antidepressants, such as Elavil, act on 3 different neurotransmitters, that are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Additionally, some selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are used in the treatment of anxiety, and personality disorders, and may be classified as drugs, created to treat, those illnesses on top. Systems that are applied for, sorting drugs, according to their chemical composition, or mechanism of action, are not restricted to, source guides, or textbooks. A number of organizations, categorize drugs, according to these practices, or practices, analogous to them. For instance, the National Drug File, reference terminology, is a system of classification, used by, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, that classifies drugs, based on 4 categories. Chemical structure of the drug. Cellular mechanism of action of the drug, or its subcellular mechanism of action. Organ, or system level of, the drug's physiological effects. Therapeutic intent of the drug. When drugs are grouped, centered on their common effects, the result is, usually 7 to 10, or even more major groupings of drugs. Many drug guides, adhere to this certain classification system, without regard to, the perspective for abuse of, or addiction to the drug. The International Drug Evaluation and Classification Program, an organization of law enforcement professionals, arranges drugs, according to 7 categories, that are employed, for the identification and clarification of the types of drugs a suspect may have been taking. The classifications of drugs are recorded by their key behavioral effects, to allow training, for law enforcement professionals, that authorizes them, to promptly ascertain, what type of drugs a person may have been taking, based on behavioral observations of the person. These 7 major categories include: central nervous system depressants. These drugs depress, or slow down, the functioning of the body's systems. They depress the communication channels between neurons and nerves. This results in reduced heart rate, reduction in breathing, lower blood pressure, etc. Drugs in this category include alcohol, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, many antidepressant medications, antipsychotic drugs, and others. Common drugs in this classification are Xanax, Valium, Seconal, Zoloft, Prozac, Paxil, Thorazine, etc. Stimulants accelerate breathing, increase a person's heart rate, result in an increase in blood pressure, and speed up the overall processes of the body, involving the processes of the CNS. These drugs also can boost a person's energy level, enhance a person's attention, lead to an aptitude to focus better, and may enhance memory when taken in small doses. In larger doses, they may produce extreme hyperactivity, cause hallucinations, and lead to delusional or even psychotic behavior. Drugs in this category include amphetamines, cocaine or crack, caffeine, methamphetamine, and many dietary aids. Familiar drugs are crystal meth, Ritalin, Adderall, Concerta, Provigil, Dexedrine, etc. Hallucinogenic drugs are every so often used as sleep promoters or hypnotic enhancers. These drugs act on the CNS, modify perception of reality, and may have a sedating impact. On the other hand, they can also have a stimulating effect. Several of these drugs were formerly used as sleep aids or by psychiatrists as aids for therapy. Examples here include drugs like LSD, ecstasy or MDMA, psilocybin, mescaline, Ambien, etc. Dissociative anesthetic drugs are employed to inhibit the perception of pain. They also alter perception, particularly vision and hearing. They produce a feeling of being detached or dissociated from the environment, hence named so. Ketamine or Special K, PCP, and analogous drugs are examples. Narcotic analgesic medications are derived from opium, or from the poppy plant, or synthetic chemicals, similar to opium. These medications are predominantly used in the treatment of pain. These drugs produce marked euphoria and mood changes in people who use them. They include opium, heroin, morphine, Vicodin, OxyContin, codeine, Darvon, Demerol, and many others. Inhalant drugs. This group includes wide-ranging breathable substances that are usually not sold as medications or drugs, but advertised for other objectives. This classification also includes anesthetics that are administered in the form of breathable gases. Examples include rubber cement, gasoline, paint thinner, hairspray, paint, etc. Cannabis products incorporates all products that contain the active ingredient, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol or THC. This category includes marijuana, hashish, and synthetic drugs, such as dronabinol. Numerous pharmaceutical textbooks add up to these classes by incorporating certain categories for antidepressant medications, antipsychotic medications, antihistamines, and so forth. There can be many different categories of drugs in a precise classification system when the drug-specific mechanism of action is deemed as the approach of classification. Next topic that we are going to discuss is drug scheduling. Drugs, substances, and several chemicals used to make up drugs are classified into 5 distinct categories, or schedules, reliant upon the drug's acceptable medical use and the drug's abuse or dependency potential. The abuse rate is a determinate element in the scheduling of the drug. For example, Schedule 1 drugs have a high potential for abuse and the potential to create severe psychological and/or physical dependence. As the drug schedule changes, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, etc., so does the abuse potential. Schedule 5 drugs represent the least potential for abuse. Let's talk about them one by one. Schedule 1 substances. Drugs in this classification are considered to have a high potential to be abused, to have no accepted medical treatment usage, to lack an accepted safe protocol for use. The drugs in this schedule are illegal to own, manufacture, or distribute, except under conditions specified by the DEA. This also includes synthetic versions of these substances. Drugs enlisted in Schedule 1 include certain opioid derivatives, such as heroin, certain hallucinogenic drugs, such as cannabis derivatives, for example marijuana, MDMA, for example ecstasy, methaqualone, peyote, and LSD. Certain stimulant drugs, such as phenethyline. Schedule 2 substances. These substances are considered to have a high potential for abuse, have accepted medical use for treatment, but typically only under certain conditions. Result in severe physical dependence or psychological dependence if abused. Except under extreme conditions, no drug appearing on Schedule II may be dispensed without a prescription, and some may not be dispensed to the general public at all, for example, cocaine. A few drugs under this designation include cocaine, which is still used in some cases as a topical anesthetic. Amphetamines, including Adderall, Dexedrine, Ritalin, Concerta, and methamphetamine. Certain narcotic drugs, including morphine, opium, codeine, fentanyl, methadone, oxycodone, and hydrocodone, for example, Vicodin. Certain barbiturates medications, such as Seconal and Nembutal. Phencyclidine or PCP. Schedule III drugs, substances, or chemicals, are defined as drugs with a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. Schedule III drugs abuse potential is less than Schedule I and Schedule II drugs, but more than Schedule IV. Some examples of Schedule III drugs are products containing less than 90 mg of codeine per dosage unit, such as Tylenol with codeine, ketamine, anabolic steroids, testosterone. Schedule IV substances. Substances in this schedule have a lower potential for abuse relative to Schedule III substances. Have evidence that they have currently accepted medical uses in the United States. May lead to more limited physical or psychological dependence when abused relative to Schedule III substances. Prescription of Schedule IV substances is similar to those in Schedule III. Drugs listed here include benzodiazepines, such as Xanax, Valium, Ativan, and Restoril. Benzodiazepine drugs, such as Lunesta and Ambien. The barbiturate phenobarbital. Provigil, modafinil. Tramadol. Sonata. Chloral hydrate. Schedule V substances. Substances in this category are considered to have a low potential for abuse relative to drugs in Schedule IV. Have accepted medical use in the United States. May lead to limited physical dependence or psychological dependence relative to Schedule IV substances if abused. Like all the drugs classified in Schedules I to IV, these drugs must also be obtained with a prescription. Some of the drugs on this list include certain cough medications that contain very small amounts of codeine and have other active ingredients. Medications that contain small amounts of opium or synthetic opium derivatives that are used to treat diarrhea. Certain anticonvulsant medications, such as Lyrica. Some antidiarrheal medications, such as Lomotil. Overall, the classification system is somewhat robust. However, even though the system appears to be firmly regulated, there remain a number of inconsistencies in the DEA's choices of where some drugs should be located. There are numerous unique requirements for certain drugs that appear to permit them to be arranged in various schedules. For example, Marinol, used to treat nausea associated with chemotherapy, actually contains the active ingredient found in cannabis. It is, however, classified as a Schedule III drug instead of a Schedule I drug because it has scientific proof for its medicinal uses, whereas cannabis itself continues on Schedule I. Of course, this discrepancy merely increases the already heated debate concerning the legalization of marijuana. A number of other contradictions can be found with other drugs, such as the observation that there is no scientific evidence that LSD in Schedule I is addictive. In addition, there is a little evidence from the area of psychiatry for prospective therapeutic properties for the drug in that perspective. Do these drugs always remain in the same classification schedule? Drugs can be allocated to different schedules dependent on accessible evidence, and may even be eliminated from the classification system as additional evidence develops. For example, Hydrocodone, which is the active ingredient in narcotic pain medications, such as Vicodin and OxyContin, was formally transferred from Schedule III to Schedule II in 2014, due to the large number of individuals who abused the drug, and new research evidence indicating that it had a higher potential for the development of abuse and addiction than previously believed. The painkiller tramadol was not put on the controlled substances schedules until 2014, when the DEA decided that it belonged on Schedule IV, based on new evidence that it had a potential for abuse. Recently, the DEA removed the drug naloxone, an opioid drug that is used to relieve constipation that is associated with use of narcotic drugs, from the classification scheme entirely. Over 160 substances have been added, moved, or removed from the classification scheme since its beginning. Let's proceed to the next classification. Suppose you are an FDA assessor, investigating a new drug application. Drug A lessens a symptom, but does not treat any disease. It does not interact with other drugs. It is believed to be safe in pregnant and breastfeeding women. At normal doses, there are practically no side effects. There is one unfortunate challenge: if 10 times the dose is taken, liver damage is expected, and may be lethal. In other populations, drug A is the #1 reason of acute liver failure. Should drug A be accessible without a prescription? Now consider a different drug. Drug B also cures a symptom, but can also be used to treat several acute and chronic ailments, some of which necessitate supervising by specialist physicians. Drug B should normally be averted in children, as it is linked with an uncommon but deadly toxicity. Even at normal doses, it can trigger a range of side effects, and serious digestive system toxicity, leading to hospital admission, is not surprising. It interacts with other prescription drugs, and can be fatal in overdose conditions. Should drug B be available without a prescription? What considerations impact if a drug can be bought without a prescription? Let's figure it out. Drug A is acetaminophen, having brand name Tylenol, a safe drug when taken at right doses, but extremely toxic in overdose. 1 in 3 overdoses are fatal, and associated with 500 deaths per year in USA. Drug B is aspirin, having the generic name acetylsalicylic acid or ASA, with acknowledged advantages for a number of illnesses, but also a notable side effect profile involving stomach ulcers, numerous drug interactions, and an accompanying probability of Ray's syndrome when provided to children. Acetaminophen and aspirin are among the first drugs that persist in routine use. Both were initially advertised long before the present-day drug licensing guidelines were executed, and both have side effect profiles and toxicities that compete with some prescription drugs. But they are barely companionless in the over-the-counter or OTC marketplace, which is a compilation of drug products with variable levels of effectiveness and safety. When it comes to rulings about access, science advises, but does not ascertain, the competence of a patient to purchase a drug without a prescription. Generally, there are only 4 distinct categories of drugs that one would bump into. These are over-the-counter or OTC medicines, pharmacy medicines or behind-the-counter or BTC medicines, prescription-only medicines or POM, and controlled drugs. These categories have their own distinctive marks for their identification, and there are separate rules enveloping the use of them. We will study them individually. Over-the-counter or OTC medicines are also known as non-prescription medicines. They can be purchased without a prescription and utilized to prevent or treat an array of ailments. All non-prescription, over-the-counter or OTC medicine labels have detailed usage and warning information so consumers can properly choose and use the products. They are categorized into General Sales List or GSL, which are a kind of medication that have only some legal constraints. They can be obtained nearly from anywhere. Even though these medicines are usually considered not dangerous, it does not mean that they have no risk. GSLs include paracetamol, some cold and flu remedies, and vitamin supplements. Next are pharmacy medicines or behind-the-counter or BTC medicines. Various countries have a considerable behind-the-counter or BTC category for drugs, which can be acquired without a prescription, but involve a pharmacist's consent for sale. In this way, the pharmacist is capable of refusing the sale if they consider it's not the right medicine for the patient. BTC drugs may have a dependency perspective, or a complex dosing schedule, or the drug may have the attributes of a prescription drug, but the demand for emergency access overshadows prescription controls, such as insulin, nitroglycerin, or EpiPens. Advocates of BTC claim that it poses larger consumer access to drugs that does not involve physician consultation, but assistance from pharmacist consultation. In certain countries, cholesterol-lowering medications, like simvastatin, are BTC, evidently pushing the limits on what can realistically be considered as self-managed situations. Pseudoephedrine was an OTC drug 4 times until it went BTC in numerous countries, not because of safety purposes, but because it's a vital component in manufacturing methamphetamine. One can distinguish these medicines by the P printed on the packaging. Pharmacy medicines include mild sleeping tablets, stronger antihistamines, and Viagra. Following BTC medicines are prescription-only medicines or POM. Prescription-only drugs are only accessible with a valid prescription from a prescriber. These drugs are closely controlled and need a visit to a prescriber for diagnosis and monitoring to make sure the medication is functioning and that it is functioning safely. Prescription drugs are meant for use by an individualistic patient to treat a particular illness. Before starting the medication, the patient is legally entitled to speak with a pharmacist regarding the drug. Prescription drugs must pass through numerous clinical trial phases, approved by the Food and Drug Administration or FDA, and supervised for safety and side effects, even after the drug is introduced into the market. Prescription-only medicines can have damaging effects and can cause severe addiction if abused. Therefore, prescription-only medicines must be prescribed by the physician or dentist. The packaging of these medicines is marked as POM. This mark is found on antidepressants, insulin, and stronger sleeping medication. The prescription or non-prescription field gets interesting to pharmacists when they start comparing between countries. Pharmacy travelers, involved in the sort of drug arbitrage, stocking up on products they can't get back home. Canadian sightseers to the United States pile up on omeprazole having brand names Prilosec or Losec for stomach problems, Neosporin antibiotic eye drops, 1% hydrocortisone cream, Primatene mist, and not long ago, naproxen having brand name Aleve. American tourists to Canada are prominent for purchasing large supplies of 222s, having codeine, aspirin, and caffeine, Tylenol No. 1 having codeine, acetaminophen, and caffeine, and until lately, antihistamines like Reactin and Claritin. Fluconazole tablets, used for yeast infections, are OTC in Canada, but prescription in the USA. It is obvious, even equating between two countries, with analogous regulatory contexts, like Canada and the USA, that there are unique aspects under consideration. Further than the policies themselves, how data is inferred seems to play a significant role in shaping conclusions about prescription status. Think about cough and cold products in children. A handful of ingredients have been used for spans and were accepted long before existing standards were in place. Clinical data backing pediatric consumption is either of inadequate methodologic excellence or deficient entirely. Over the preceding few years, reports of side effects in children triggered numerous countries to re-examine this group of products, as they were fatal in some cases. An FDA consultative board determined that cough and cold products in children were ineffective and possibly hazardous. The board advised that they should be relabeled to indicate "do not use in children under the age of 6." Following this announcement, product manufacturers willingly relabeled their products to mention "do not use in children under the age of 4." Just about the same time, Health Canada declared that cough and cold products would be relabeled to advise against use in children under the age of 6. Drugs developed just for this age group will no longer be put up for sale. This encompasses a prior decision to eradicate any products from market meant for children under the age of 2. In Australia, cough and cold products are now labeled "do not use" for those under the age of 2, but they are obtainable by prescription. They stay for marketing and selling, with labeling for children aged 2 to 12. In the United Kingdom, products for children under the age of 6 were withdrawn. Medication for children aged 6 to 12 will continue to be available, with additional warnings on the label for regulators. Same data. 4 different decisions. Each regulator had to weigh concerns, such as the slight and self-limiting nature of the disease, the after-effects of rare, but occasionally serious side effects, the apparent efficiency of restrictions or relabeling, and the overall philosophy about minimum safety standards for licensed drug products. The last category in this system is controlled drugs. Controlled drugs are the most critical category of drugs. Although they have effects similar to prescription-only medicines, these drugs have been exclusively listed as controlled drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. These medicines also necessitate a prescription from a medical professional, such as a physician or dentist. They have specified restrictions as to how they are dispensed, stored, and administered. Controlled drugs are all marked with POM and CD on the packaging. We have already discussed them in drug scheduling in this video. Alongside this is Biopharmaceutics Classification System or BCS. Biopharmaceutics Classification System or BCS is a regulatory mechanism through which drug developers and generic companies can obtain a waiver of clinical bioequivalence studies, also called a biowaiver. BCS divides compounds into 4 categories based on their permeability and solubility. Class 1 having high solubility, high permeability. Class 2 having low solubility, high permeability. Class 3 having high solubility, low permeability. Class 4 having low solubility, low permeability. The high permeability and high solubility character of Class 1 compounds allows high concentrations in the gut to saturate both efflux and uptake transporters. Efflux transporters may have a significant effect on the penetration of compounds through the blood-brain barrier. If systemic concentration of the compounds is lower, transporters may overcome the effect of its high passive permeability. These compounds can also be involved in transporter-mediated drug-drug interactions. These compounds are well absorbed, and their absorption rate is usually higher than excretion. For example, propranolol, verapamil, metoprolol, paracetamol, etc. High permeability Class 2 compounds will pass through the gut membranes, and uptake transporters will have no effect on absorption. However, their low solubility will limit the concentration at the enterocytes, thereby preventing saturation of efflux transporters. Consequently, efflux transporters will affect the extent of oral bioavailability and the rate of absorption of Class 2 compounds. The bioavailability of those products is limited by their solvation rate. For example, ketoprofen, naproxen, carbamazepine, glibenclamide, bicalutamide, ezetimibe, aceclofenac, etc. Availability of class 3 compounds will be sufficient in the gut lumen due to their good solubility, but an uptake transporter will be necessary to overcome the poor permeability of these compounds. Apical efflux transporters may also be important for the absorption of such compounds when sufficient penetration is achieved via an uptake transporter. The absorption is limited by the permeation rate, but the drug is solvated very fast. For example, ranitidine, cimetidine, atenolol, vancomycin, etc. Due to the low permeability and low solubility of class 4 compounds, both uptake and efflux transporters play an important role in the oral bioavailability. These compounds have a poor bioavailability. Usually they are not well absorbed over the intestinal mucosa, and a high variability is expected. For example, furosemide, hydrochlorothiazide, bifonazole, etc. Next is classification system of drugs based on mechanism of actions. This classification system is based on the system developed by Iming et al., who published an article in 2004. They called their system TCAT for target, chemistry, anatomy, therapy. Their list of targets was the most attractive in creating a classification of drug action, because one is usually able to say that any provided drug acts on certain sort of target, even when the target is the pH of the body water, or the permeability of the lipid bilayer. By working out on this base, one can commence to classify drugs according to how they interact with that target. As far as possible, a literature search was performed to look for a better or more official peer-reviewed system. None was found. This classification system is based on these assumptions. Drugs exert an effect on the body. This effect is exerted by either interacting with macromolecular structures in the body, or by changing the physical or chemical properties of the body. The former can be described as a receptor-effector coupling mechanisms, and the latter as a non-receptor mechanisms. Let's discuss it with examples. First one is non-receptor mechanisms of drug action. This includes change in the physical or chemical properties of the medium or solution, for example, sodium bicarbonate, helium. Change in the physical or chemical properties of another exogenous substance. For example, Sagamidix, D-spheroxamine, activated charcoal. Action by physical properties of the drug itself. For example, the reflective properties of zinc oxide. Next is receptor mechanisms of drug action. This incorporates direct effect by binding with a receptor. Most drugs, for example, opioid analgesics. Indirect effect by binding with an acceptor, for example, by preventing the binding of another substance or displacing it from its usual binding site. For example, action of phenytoin on warfarin. Modulation of receptor function, that is, changing its function or affinity for its ligand without binding to any active site. For example, benzodiazepines. Acting as a substrate for a receptor, for example vitamins, oxygen. Last one is types of molecular receptor targets and signaling pathways. It includes interaction with the cell membrane, for example amphotericin. Regulation of transmembrane protein activity. It involves ligand-gated or voltage-gated ion channel permeability. For example, lignocaine, succinylethonium. Transmembrane transport protein activity. For example, SSRIs. Regulation of transmembrane enzymes with intracellular signaling pathways, for example, tyrosine kinases, which are insulin receptors. G-protein coupled receptor activity, for example, beta blockers. Acting as a substrate for enzyme activity. For example, oxygen, glucose. acting as a false substrate for an enzyme. For example, methyl-dopa. Regulation of enzyme activity. It includes intracellular enzymes, for example phosphodiesterase, such as milrinone. Extracellular enzymes, for example acetylcholinesterase, such as neostigmine. Interaction with intracellular nuclear macromolecules. It incorporates regulation of gene transcription, for example, corticosteroids. Interaction with genetic material, such as chlorambucil, cisplatin. Next is drug classification schedule of medicines during pregnancy. To help out pregnant women and their healthcare providers decide on prescription and OTC drugs carefully, the FDA established a drug schedule for pregnant women. It's a classifying system, categorizing drugs in categories from A, considered safest, with controlled human studies that have shown no fetal risks, through X, drugs that have proven fetal risks that outweigh any possible benefit. Letter categories are selected based on what studies have shown about the medicine when used in pregnant women and animals. The FDA is phasing out this system. Pregnancy category A. In human studies, pregnant women used the medicine, and their babies did not have any problems related to using the medicine. For example, folic acid, levothyroxine, which is a thyroid hormone medicine, dextromethorphan, etc. Pregnancy category B. In humans, there are no good studies. But in animal studies, pregnant animals received the medicine, and the babies did not show any problems related to the medicine. For example, some antibiotics like amoxicillin, ondansetron having brand name Zofran, for nausea, metformin having brand name glucophage, for diabetes. Some insulins used to treat diabetes, such as regular and NPH insulin, etc. Pregnancy category C. No animal studies have been done, and there are no good studies in pregnant women. For examples, fluconazole having brand name diflucan, for yeast infections, albuterol having brand name Ventolin, for asthma, sertraline having brand name Zoloft, and fluoxetine having brand name Prozac, for depression, etc. Pregnancy category D. Studies in humans and other reports show that, when pregnant women use the medicine, some babies are born with problems related to the medicine. However, in some serious situations, the medicine may still help the mother and the baby more than it might harm. For example, paroxetine having brand name Paxil for depression, lithium for bipolar disorder, phenytoin having brand name Dilantin, for epileptic seizures, some cancer chemotherapy, etc. Pregnancy category X. Studies or reports in humans or animals show that mothers using the medicine during pregnancy may have babies with problems related to the medicine. There are no situations where the medicine can help the mother or baby enough to make the risk of problems worth it. These medicines should never be used by pregnant women. For example, isotretinoin having brand name Accutane, for cystic acne, thalidomide having brand name Thalamid, for a type of skin disease, oral contraceptives, etc. The FDA is changing prescription medicine label information, and the pregnancy part of the label will alter over the following few years. As this prescription information is revised, it is included in an online information clearinghouse from the NIH and the U.S. National Library of Medicine, called DailyMed, that provides up-to-date, free of charge information to consumers and healthcare providers. Upcoming is classification of drugs based on chemical structure. This is a popular classification of drugs. Mostly, drugs that have the same drug action and pharmacological effect have a basic skeletal structure and a minute variation in the branching. This is why some drugs have more potential than the other. For example, all sulfonamides have the same skeletal structure and show antibacterial activity. Let's proceed to the next classification, and that is classification of drugs based on molecular targets. This classification is based on the type of macromolecule or biomolecule the drugs interact with. The common drug targets can be carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates, such as cell surface carbohydrates, antigen, and recognition molecules. Proteins including receptors, enzymes, carrier proteins, structural proteins. Lipids including cell membrane lipids target. Nucleic acids including DNA and RNA. The drugs with similar structures have similar reactions with such biomolecules. For example, sulfonamides are antibacterial agents that inhibit the synthesis of nucleic acid in bacteria by acting on enzyme dihydroeperoxyate synthetase, which is essential for the synthesis of bacterial DNA. The bacterial growth and replication are abruptly stopped as no starting material is available for the synthesis of nucleic acid, and the drug demonstrates bacteriostatic effect. Next up is classification of crude drugs. Let's begin by understanding what crude drugs are. Crude drugs are natural substances which are obtained from a large variety of natural sources. They are comprised of roughly all parts of plants and animals, such as whole plants and herbs, their morphological or anatomical parts, saps, exudates, extracts, secretions, and other constituents, whole animals, their anatomical parts, glands or other organs, extracts, secretions, and other constituents of their organs. The most vital natural sources of drugs are higher plants, microbes, and animals, and marine organisms. Various useful products are acquired from minerals that are both organic and inorganic in nature. In order to conveniently study all these natural crude drugs of diverse categories, it is crucial to classify or arrange them into some smaller groups by adopting some certain sequence of arrangement. This is referred to a system of classification of crude drugs. Because of their extensive distribution, each arrangement of categorization has its own advantages and shortcomings, but for the rationale of study, the drugs are classified in these different ways, namely: alphabetical classification, taxonomical classification, morphological classification, pharmacological classification, chemical classification, chemotaxonomical classification, and serotaxonomical classification. Let's discuss them in detail. First one is alphabetical classification. It is the easiest way of sorting disconnected items. Crude drugs are arranged in alphabetical order of their Latin and English names, or common names, or sometimes local language names, or vernacular names. Some of the pharmacopoeias, dictionaries, and reference books which classify crude drugs according to this system are: Indian Pharmacopoeia, British Pharmacopoeia, British Herbal Pharmacopoeia, United States Pharmacopoeia, and National Formulary, British Pharmaceutical Codex, European Pharmacopoeia. In European Pharmacopoeia, drugs are arranged according to their Latin names. On the other hand, in United States Pharmacopoeia, or USP, and British Pharmaceutical Codex, or BPC, these are arranged in English. Examples include acacia, benzoin, cinchona, dill, ergot, fennel, gentian, hyoscyamus, ipecacuanha, jalap, kirchi, licorice, mints, nux vomica, opium, podophyllum, quassia, rauwolfia, senna, basaka, wolfat, yellow beeswax, and zadori. It has pros that it is simple and quick to use. There is no duplication of entries, and is devoid of uncertainty. In this system, location tracing and addition of drug entries is easy. It has a drawback that there is no relationship between preceding and consecutive drug entries. Next is taxonomical classification. Taxonomy is the branch of biology that classifies all living things. It was developed by the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus, who lived during the 18th century, and his system of classification is still used today. Linnaeus invented binomial nomenclature, the system of giving each type of organism a genus and species name. He also developed a classification system called the taxonomic hierarchy, which today has 8 ranks, from general to specific, that are domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, we will discuss the taxonomic ranks that make up the taxonomic hierarchy, briefly. A domain is the highest and most general rank of organisms. Linnaeus did invent some of the taxonomic ranks, but he did not invent the domain rank, which is relatively new. The term domain was not used until 1990, over 250 years after Linnaeus developed his classification system in 1735. The 3 domains of life are bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. Eukaryota, or every living thing on Earth that is not a bacterium or archaean, is more closely related to the domain archaea than to bacteria. Before domains were introduced, kingdom was the highest taxonomic rank. In the past, the different kingdoms were Kingdom Animalia, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Fungi, Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Archaea, and Kingdom Bacteria. Archaea and bacteria were sometimes grouped into one kingdom, Monera. However, some of those groupings, such as Protista, are not very accurate. Protista includes all eukaryotic organisms that are not animals, plants, or fungi, but some of these organisms are not very closely related to one another. Biologist Whittaker gave us the 5-kingdom classification, classifying all the living organisms into 5 kingdoms: Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Monera, Kingdom Fungi, Kingdom Plantae, and Kingdom Animalia. There is no set agreement on the kingdom classification, and some researchers have abandoned it altogether. Currently, it continues to be revised. In 2015, researchers suggested splitting Protista into 2 new kingdoms: Kingdom Protozoa and Kingdom Primista. Phylum comes from a Greek word poulon, meaning race. Phylum is the next rank after kingdom. It is more specific than kingdom, but less specific than class. It has a common design, or organization, which is shared by all members of the phylum, even though structural details may differ greatly because of evolution. The assumption is made by biologists that all members of a phylum have a common ancestry. Class was the most general rank proposed by Linnaeus. Phyla were not introduced until the 19th century. The classes of Animalia that Linnaeus proposed are similar to the ones used today, but Linnaeus' classes of plants were based on attributes, like the arrangement of flowers, rather than relatedness. Order is more specific than class. The names of the orders end in ales. Each order is divided into families. Family is, in turn, more specific. The names of families, in modern classification, are usually derived from a genus of the family, known as the type genus. The family names of animals always end in idea-e, as in Equidae, the horse family. Those of plants almost always end in acea-e, as in Dipsacacee, the teasel family. Genus is even more specific than family. It is the first part of an organism's scientific name, using binomial nomenclature. A biological species is defined as a group of natural populations that mate and produce offspring with one another, but do not breed with other populations. It is the second part of an organism's scientific name. While each genus name is unique, the same species names can be used for different organisms. For example, Ursus americanus is the American black bear, while Bufo americanus is the American toad. Remember, an organism's scientific name is always italicized. Genus and species are the only taxonomic ranks that are italicized. The genus name is capitalized, while the species name is not. Let's discuss the taxonomical classification with the example of apple plant. Kingdom, Plantae. Subkingdom, Viridiplantae. Infrakingdom, Streptophyta. Superdivision, Embryophyta. Division, Tracheophyta. Subdivision, Spermatophytina. Class, Magnoliopsida. Superorder, Rosinii. Order, Rosalis. Family, Rosacea. Genus, Malus mill. Species, Malus pumila mill. So, the scientific name for apple is Malus pumila. Taxonomical classification is advantageous for studying evolutionary advancements. But this system does not correlate the chemical constituents and biological activity of the drugs. Now, we will move towards morphological classification. Crude drugs are generally apportioned into the two major units, based on their evident morphological forms of existence and structural organization of the plant or animal parts, and their natural products, which constitute the crude drugs. First are organized crude drugs, which are composed of definite organized, histological, or cellular structures and tissues. They are, therefore, made up of whole plants, or animals, or any of their organs, or any morphological or anatomical parts derived from them. The organized crude plant drugs are again further divided into the two groups, according to position of the plant's organs, that constitute the crude drugs. Drugs from overground organs, which include all drugs that are derived from the overground or aerial parts or organs of plants. The crude drugs of the overground organs are further divided into plants and herbs. For example, ergot, ephedra, bacopa, andrographis, calmeg, yeast, vinca, datura, centella, etc. Leaves. For example, digitalis, eucalyptus, gymnema, mint, senna, spearmint, squill, tulsi, visakha, coca, buchu, hamamelis, hyoscyamus, belladonna, tea, etc. Flowering parts. For example, clove, pyrethrum, saffron, santonica, chamomile, etc. Fruits. For example, amla, anise, bale, bahira, bitter orange peel, capsicum, caraway, cardamom, colocynth, coriander, cumin, dill, fennel, gokru, herda, lemon peel, centipede, star anise, tamarind, vidong, etc. Seeds. For example, bitter almond, black mustard, cardamom, ispigula, calidana, linseed, nutmeg, nux vomica, physostigma, psyllium, strophanthus, white mustard, etc. Woods. For example, quassia, sandalwood, and red sandalwood, etc. Barks. For example, arjuna, ashoka, cascara, cassia, cinchona, cinnamon, kirchi, quillia, wild cherry, etc. Hair and fibers. For example, cotton, hemp, jute, silk, flax, etc. Drugs from underground organs, which include all drugs that are derived from underground or subterranean parts or organs of plants. The underground organs are further divided into Roots. For example, aconite, ginseng, glycyrrhiza, Indian belladonna, licorice, etc. Rhizomes. For example, ginger, rhubarb, etc. Bulb. For example, garlic, amaryllis, tulips, daffodils, and lilies. Corm drugs, on the basis of their morphological identity. For example, crocus, gladiolas, tuberous begonias, etc. Second are unorganized crude drugs, which are devoid of any definite histological or cellular structures, and are derived from plants and animals by different extraction processes, or as natural secretions. The unorganized drugs are also divided into smaller groups on the basis of the nature of the natural product, such as dry juices. For example, aloe, quinoa, etc. Dried lattices. For example, opium, papain, etc. Dried extracts. For example, agar, alginate, black catechu, pale catechu, pectin, etc. Gums. For example, acacia, guar gum, Indian gum, sterculia, tragacanth, etc. Resins. For example, asafoetida, benzoin, colophony, copibaguaiacum, gugul, mastic, coal tar, tar, tolu balsam, storax, sundarak, etc. Fixed oils and fats. For example, arachis, castor, chamogra, coconut, cottonseed, linseed, olive, sesame, almond, theobroma, cod liver, halibut liver, cocoa butter, etc. Volatile oils. For example, turpentine, anise, coriander, peppermint, rosemary, sandalwood, cinnamon, lemon, caraway, dill, clove, eucalyptus, nutmeg, camphor, etc. Waxes. For example, beeswax, spermaceti, carnauba wax, etc. Alkaloids. For example, black pepper, cocoa, poppy plant, etc. Glycosides. For example, digitalis purpurea, digitalis lanata, etc. Animal products. For example, beeswax, cantharides, cod liver oil, gelatin, halibut liver oil, honey, shark liver oil, shellac, spermaceti wax, wool fat, musk, lactose, etc. Fossil organism and minerals. For example, bentonite, kaolin, kieselguhr, talc, etc. Its merits include: morphological classification is more useful to identify and detect adulteration. This system of classification is more appropriate for practical study, particularly when the chemical nature of the drug is not evidently understood. Its demerits incorporate: the main drawback of morphological classification is that there is no association of chemical constituents with the therapeutic actions. Repetition of drugs or plants occurs. Upcoming is pharmacological classification. Assemblage of drugs, according to their pharmacological action, or of most vital constituent, or their therapeutic usage, is characterized as pharmacological, or therapeutic classification of drug. Drugs are put together, regardless of their components used, or phylogenetic relationship, or the nature of phytoconstituents they have. This classification is more appropriate, and is primarily a pursued approach. Now, we will discuss the pharmacological categories, with examples in detail. First are the drugs acting on gastrointestinal tract. These include carminative. For example, fennel, cardamom, mentha, etc. Emetic. For example, ipecac, etc. Antiemetic. For example, curchi, ipecac, etc. Laxative. For example, agar, banana, isabgol, etc. Purgative. For example, senna, castor oil, etc. Cathartic. For example, senna, etc. Secondary, drugs acting on respiratory system. These include expectorant. For example, Visaka, ipecac, licorice, etc. Antitussive. For example, opium-containing codeine, etc. Bronchodilator. For example, ephedra, tea, etc. Third category includes drugs acting on cardiovascular system. These are cardiotonic. For example, digitalis, squil, strophanthus, etc. Cardiac depressant. For example, cinchona, veratrum, etc. Vasoconstrictor. For example, ergot, etc. Antihypertensive. For example, Rauwolfia, etc. Fourth category contains drugs acting on autonomic nervous system. This holds adrenergic. For example, ephedra, etc. Cholinergic. For example, physostigma, pilocarpus, etc. Anticholinergic. For example, datura, belladonna, etc. Fifth category comprises of drugs acting on central nervous system. This covers central analgesic. For example, opium products, such as morphine, etc. CNS depressant. For example, belladonna, opium, hyoscyamus, etc. CNS stimulant. For example, tea, coffee, etc. Analeptic. For example, nux vomica, camphor, lobelia, etc. Sixth category includes antispasmodic drugs. For example, datura, hyoscyamus, opium, curare, etc. Seventh category consists of anti-cancer drugs. For example, vinca, podophyllum, taxus, etc. Eighth category involves anti-rheumatic drugs. For example, aconite, colchicum, guggul, etc. Ninth category encompasses anthelmintic drugs. For example, quassia, vidong, etc. 10th category incorporates astringents. For example, catechu, myrobalans, etc. 11th category integrates antimalarial drugs. For example, cinchona, artemisia, etc. 12th category fits in immunomodulatory drugs. For example, ginseng, ashwagandha, tulsi, etc. 13th category entails immunizing agents. For example, vaccines, sera, antitoxins, etc. 14th category consists of drugs acting on skin. For example, beeswax, wolfat, balsam of Tolu, balsam of Peru, etc. 15th category resides chemotherapeutic agents. For example, antibiotics, etc. Last category contains local anesthetics. For example, coca, etc. It has advantages that, from the pharmacist's point of view, this system in fact appears to be a perfect one, as it delivers the critical information about a drug. This system of classification can be used for proposing alternatives of drugs if they are not accessible at a certain place or point of time. It has drawback that drugs having different action on the body are classed individually in more than one group that causes vagueness and chaos. For example, cinchona is antimalarial drug because of existence of quinine, but can be put under the group of drug affecting heart because of antiarrhythmic action of quinidine. The problems of adulteration in storage, and incompatibility in formulation, are more likely, if this system of classification is used without proper care. Forthcoming is the chemical classification. The crude drugs are classified, depending upon the active constituents. Regardless of the morphological or taxonomical characters, the drugs with analogous chemical constituents are bracketed into the same group. We will review chemical constituent groups with examples in detail. First one is alkaloids. Examples include cinchona, datura, vinca, ipecac, nux vomica, etc. Second group is glycosides. For example, senna, aloe, ginseng, glycyrrhiza, digitalis, etc. Third chemical constituent group is carbohydrates and its derived products, such as acacia, tragacanth, starch, isabgol, etc. Fourth group includes volatile oils. For example, clove, coriander, fennel, cinnamon, cumin, etc. Fifth group incorporates resin and resin combination, such as benzoin, tolo balsam, balsam of Peru, etc. Sixth group integrates tannins. For example, catechu, tea, etc. Seventh group fit in enzymes. For example, papain, casein, trypsin, etc. Eighth group contains lipids. For example, beeswax, cocoon butter, lanolin, etc. This system of classification has some strengths that include: since the pharmacological actions and therapeutic uses of drugs depend on their chemical constituents, this system of classification appears to be an ideal one. Specific plant families demonstrate distinct types of chemical principles. For example, tropane alkaloids characterize the Solanaceae family. Volatile oils are common in the Umbelliferae family, while Pinaceae contains mainly oleoresins. Thus, from chemical point of view, also the plants of these families are closely related. In that sense, this system is ideal, not only for study, but also for storage. Its disadvantages include: drugs of different origin are grouped under similar chemical titles. This type of classification makes no proper placement of drugs containing two different types of chemicals. For example, certain drugs are found to contain alkaloids and glycosides, such as cinchona, fixed oils, and volatile oils, such as nutmeg, of equal importance together, and hence it is difficult to categorize them properly. Succeeding is chemotaxonomical classification. This system of classification counts on the chemical similarity of a taxon, that is, it is centered on the existence of association between constituents in several plants. There are specific kinds of chemical components that describe certain classes of plants. This gives rise to wholly a new notion of chemotaxonomy that applies chemical facts or characters for recognizing the taxonomical status, relationships, and the evolution of the plants. For example, tropane alkaloids commonly occur among the members of Solanaceae, thereby acting as a chemotaxonomic pointer. Likewise, other secondary plant metabolites can serve as the foundation of classification of crude drugs. The berberine alkaloid and berberis, and argemini, rutin and rutaceae members, ranunculaceae alkaloids among its members, etc., are some other examples. It is the most recent system of classification that gives more scope for understanding the relationship between chemical constituents, their biosynthesis, and their possible action. Last one is serotaxonomical classification. Let's learn some definitions first. Serology can be characterized as the study of the antigen-antibody reaction. Antigens are the substances which can stimulate the formation of the antibody. Antibodies are highly specific, protein molecules, produced by plasma cells, in the immune system. Serotaxonomy can be described as the study about, the application, or the efficacy of serology, in solving the taxonomical challenges. Protein are carriers of the taxonomical knowledge, and generally used as antigen, in serotaxonomy. Serotaxonomical classification articulates the similarities and the dissimilarities among various taxa, and these data are beneficial in taxonomy. It defines the degree of resemblance between species, genera, family, etc., by evaluating the reaction with antigens from several plant taxa with antibodies present against a given taxon. Serology facilitates the comparison of non-morphological traits, which supports the taxonomical data. This procedure also facilitates in the comparison of specific proteins from various plant taxa. Next up is pharmacological classification. Let's discuss some definitions. Pharmacologic class is a group of active moieties that share scientifically documented properties and is defined on the basis of any combination of three characteristics of the active moiety that are: mechanism of action or MOA, physiologic effect or PE, chemical structure or CS. Established pharmacologic class or EPC is a text phrase that represents a pharmacologic class related with an authorized indication of an active moiety that the FDA has revealed to be scientifically acceptable and clinically significant. Pharmacological classification includes drugs acting on autonomic nervous system or ANS, drugs acting on central nervous system or CNS, drugs acting on cardiovascular system or CVS, drugs used to treat blood diseases, drugs acting on gastrointestinal tract or GIT, drugs acting on respiratory system, drugs acting on urinary system, chemotherapeutic agents, drugs used to treat inflammation and pyrexia, immunomodulators, drugs used to treat hormonal disorders, dermatological agents, autocoids, drugs used to treat other diseases, disorders, and systems, such as drugs used to treat obesity, drugs acting on smooth muscles, drugs acting on skeletal muscles, etc. We will discuss the pharmacological classes of drugs in detail in our next videos. Upcoming is classification of drugs according to therapeutic effect. In response to the shortcomings of the traditional pharmacological classification system, Thorer Bjornsson's 1996 paper proposed an alternative, which is more correlated to the intent of the user. In this approach, atorvastatin and the chickenpox vaccine are both classified as Category 0 substances, preventative in their objective. In summary, this system includes Category 0 or preventative drugs. This encompasses drugs or drug uses that are targeted at preventing the occurrence or development of a disease when none exists. For example, vaccines, anticoagulants such as heparin, etc. Category 1 or drugs directed at the specific disease etiology. These drugs prevent the disease process from developing or aim to reverse it. For example, antibiotics, steroids for Addison's disease, etc. Category 2 or drugs which correct pathophysiological processes. These drugs cannot address the underlying etiology, but can ameliorate its effects on the patient. For example, antihypertensives for hypertension, etc. Category 3 or drugs which address specific disease manifestations. They act without either addressing the etiology or any specific pathophysiological processes. For example, antipsychotics in schizophrenia, etc. Category 4 or drugs, which address non-specific disease-related symptoms. For example, analgesics and antihistamines. Category 5 or drugs, which do not treat any specific disease. For example, general anesthetics, muscle relaxants, and diagnostic agents like edrophonium. Next is classification of drugs based on duration of action. These include ultra-short-acting drugs. For example, thiopental, methohexital, hexobarbital, ultra-short-acting insulin such as insulin lispro, etc. Short-acting drugs. For example, midazolam, triazolam, secobarbital, pentobarbital, dextroamphetamine sulfate, dexmethylphenidate, methamphetamine, and methylphenidate or MPH, regular insulin, etc. Intermediate-acting drugs. For example, alprazolam, oxazepam, temazepam, butabarbital, alabarbital, amylobarbital, intermediate-acting insulin such as NPH and LONT, etc. Long-acting drugs. For example, chlorodiazepoxide, clonazepam, diazepam, flurazepam, phenobarbital, barbitone, methylphenobarbital, long-acting insulin such as ultralente insulin, etc. Ultra-long-acting drugs. For example, ivermectin, ultra-long-acting oral HIV therapies, etc. Forthcoming is classification of drugs based on receptor theory. Receptor theory is the application of receptor models to describe drug behavior. Pharmacological receptor models preceded correct information of receptors by many years. Drugs are also categorized on the basis of receptors, some of which are cholinesterase agents. For example, acetylcholine, pilocarpine, physostigmine, neostigmine, pyridostigmine, edrophonium, etc. Adrenoceptor agents. For example, norepinephrine, phenylephrine, methyldopa, clonidine, albuterol, salmeterol, etc. Serotonin receptor agents. For example, serotonin, buspirone, dihydroergotamine, lithium, lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, meperidine, metoclopramide, and triptans such as sumatriptan. Dopamine receptor agents. For example, dopamine, bromocriptine, apomorphine, lyseride, gabergoline, etc. Alongside it is classification of drugs based on symptoms or diseases in which they are used. Drugs are also classified on the basis of symptoms or diseases in which they are used. These include anticonvulsants, antidementia agents, antidepressants, antiemetics, antiepileptic agents, anti-inflammatory agents, antihypertensive agents, antimalarial agents, antimigraine agents, antimyasthenic agents, antineoplastics, anti-Parkinson agents, antipsychotics, antitubercular agents, anxiolytic agents, bipolar agents, disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, or DMARDs, inflammatory bowel disease agents, metabolic bone disease agents, sedatives, and hypnotics, etc. After that is classification of drugs based on organ system affected. This categorization signifies the organization of anatomical therapeutic chemical classification system. Usually, drugs outlined within the ATC classification system should be included in this classification. It has the 14 subcategories, which are antineoplastic and immunomodulating drugs, drugs acting on the blood and blood-forming organs, drugs acting on the cardiovascular system, dental drugs, dermatologic drugs, erythropoiesis-stimulating agents, drugs acting on the gastrointestinal system and metabolism, drugs acting on the genitourinary system, drugs acting on the musculoskeletal system, drugs acting on the nervous system, ophthalmology drugs, otologicals, drugs acting on the respiratory system, systemic hormonal preparations. To come is classification of drugs based on generations. Antipsychotic medications are used to treat and manage symptoms for numerous psychiatric disorders and are generally categorized into two classes. First-generation antipsychotics or FGs. They are also known as typical antipsychotics and were developed in the 1950s. To date, FGs have been categorized according to their chemical structure, which includes dopamine antagonists. For example, phenothiazines, for example, chlorpromazine, thioridazine. Butyrophenones, for example, haloperidol, droperidol. Dibenzoxazepines, for example, loxapine. Combined D2, D3 receptor antagonists. For example, amisulpride, etc. Multi-acting, receptor-targeted antipsychotics, or MARTA. For example, clozapine, olanzapine, quetiapine, asenapine, etc. Second-generation antipsychotics or SGS. They are also known as atypical antipsychotics and were emerged in the 1980s. SGS have been categorized, according to their pharmacological properties, as dopamine partial agonists. There is ongoing research testing these proposed mechanisms of action within each class with respect to the neurobiology of different psychiatric disorders. It includes serotonin, dopamine antagonists, or SDA. For example, risperidone and its metabolites paliperidone, ziprasidone, iloperidone, lurasidone, etc. Other examples of SGS include amisulpride, which is D2, D3 receptor blocker, olanzapine, which is dopamine serotonin type 2 or 5-HT2 antagonist, quetiapine. It has affinity for D2, 5-HT2A, H1, alpha-1 and 5-HT1A receptors. Antidepressants are medications that are used to treat major depressive disorders, some anxiety disorders, some chronic pain conditions, and for the management of some addictions. Antidepressants are classified into 5 generations, which are: first-generation antidepressants. They affect various neurotransmitter systems and are linked with many undesirable effects. For example, tricyclic antidepressants TCS, meprodoline, etc. Second-generation antidepressants. They are already devoid of anticholinergic action and have weaker adrenolinic and antihistaminic effects. For example, mianserine, mirtazapine, trazodone, etc. Third-generation antidepressants. The antidepressant action of third generation is mediated only by one of the 3 main neurotransmitters for depression that are 5-HT, noradrenaline, and histamine. They do not affect muscarine, histamine, and adrenergic cerebral systems. For example, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors SSRIs, ipsaparone, viloxazine, reboxetine, bupropione, etc. Fourth-generation antidepressants only influence the serotonin and noradrenaline or dopamine system. For example, milnacipran, bifloxetone, etc. Fifth-generation antidepressants foresee the exclusive action on 5-HT, noradrenaline, and dopamine systems of CNS in varying ratios. For example, venlafaxine, sarclamine, etc. Antiepileptic drugs, or AEDs. They are used to treat seizure disorders. Currently, They are among the most common medications for which medical laboratories perform therapeutic drug monitoring, that is TDM. They are comprised of two generations. First-generation antiepileptic drugs. They were introduced by US and European drug makers some decades ago. They have complex pharmacokinetics, as well as narrow therapeutic index. For example, carbamazepine, ethosuximide, phenobarbital, phenytoin, primidone and valproic acid. Second generation or newer antiepileptic drugs. In the last 20 years, 14 more, so-called newer generation, AEDs, entered the market. In comparison to first-generation AEDs, the newer drugs have wider therapeutic ranges and fewer serious side effects. For example, eslicarbazepine acetate, felbamate, gabapentin, lacosamide, lamotrigine, levetiracetam, oxcarbazepine, pregabalin, rufinamide, stiripentol, diagabine, topiramate, vigabatrin, and zonisamide. Penicillins. It is the most famous of all antibiotics, named for fungal mold, Penicillium notatum, from which it is derived. The name penicillium was taken from the Latin word penicillium, meaning a painter's brush, because the fronds of the fungus were thought to look like a painter's brush. The penicillins are bactericidal drugs. They inhibit bacterial cell wall synthesis by binding and inactivating proteins, named penicillin-binding proteins, present in bacterial cell wall. They inhibit the transpeptidation reaction and block cross-linking of the cell wall. They are divided into 4 generations, including natural and anti-staphylococcal penicillins. They have limited spectrum and are mostly effective against gram-positive bacteria. For example, penicillin G and V, nafcillin, and oxacillin. Aminopenicillins. They have broader spectrum and effective against some enteric gram-negatives. For example, ampicillin, amoxicillin. Carboxypenicillins. They have activity against nosocomial gram-negatives. For example, carbenicillin, ticarcillin. Uredopenicillins. They are active against Pseudomonas aeruginosa. For example, piperacillin, meslocillin. The cephalosporins are a class of beta-lactam antibiotics, originally derived from the fungus Acremonium, which was previously known as Cephalosporium. They are bactericidal and act by disrupting the synthesis of peptidoglycan layer, forming the bacterial cell wall. What are the different generations of cephalosporins? Cephalosporins are clustered together, based on the type of bacteria that they are most effective against. There are 5 generations of cephalosporins. We will learn them, one by one. First-generation cephalosporins. They are very effective against gram-positive bacteria, but they are only to some extent effective against gram-negative bacteria. Examples of first-generation cephalosporins include cephalexin, having brand name Keflex; cefadroxil, having brand name Duracev; cephridine, having brand name Valocev. Second-generation cephalosporins. They also target some types of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, but they're less effective against certain gram-positive bacteria than first-generation cephalosporins are. Examples of second-generation cephalosporins include cefaclor, having brand name Kekler; cefurazime, having brand name Cefton; cefprozil, having brand name Spzil. Third-generation cephalosporins. They are more effective against gram-negative bacteria, as compared to both the first and second generations. They're also more active against bacteria that may be resistant to previous generations of cephalosporins. The third generation also tend to be less active than previous generations against gram-positive bacteria, including Streptococcus and Staphylococcus species. A few examples of third-generation cephalosporins include Cefixime, having brand name Suprax; Ceftibuten, having brand name Sadex; Cefpodoxime, having brand name Vantin. Fourth-generation cephalosporins. Cefepime, having brand name Maxipime, is the only fourth-generation cephalosporin that's available in the United States. While effective against a variety of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, it's usually reserved for more severe infections. Fifth-generation cephalosporins. They are referred to as advanced-generation cephalosporins. There's one fifth-generation cephalosporin, ceftaroline, having brand name Teflaro, available in the United States. This cephalosporin can be used to treat bacteria, including methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, that is, MRSA, and Streptococcus species, that are resistant to penicillin antibiotics. Or else, ceftaroline's action is similar to that of third-generation cephalosporins, even though it isn't effective against Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Sulfonylureas are oral hypoglycemic agents. They work on the pancreas and try to increase the beta cell production of insulin. This assumes the pancreas is sluggish, and it tries to stimulate it. There are two generations of sulfonylureas. It is pretty rare to see a first generation used to any further extent. The first generations are the older ones. If one fails at a maximum dose, that means all first-generation sulfonylureas will fail, and a first-generation sulfonylurea is not going to work. As for the second generations, if one fails at a maximum dose, other ones could be tried. First-generation sulfonylureas include chloropropamide, having brand name Diabenes; talazomide, having brand name Dilinus; dalbutamide, having brand name Oronase. Second-generation sulfonylureas include glipizide, having brand name Glucotrol; glyburide, having brand name Diabeta and micronase; glimepiride, having brand name Amaryl. Following are antihistamines. Histamine is a biologically active substance that potentiates the inflammatory and immune responses of the body, regulates physiological function in the gut, and acts as a neurotransmitter. Antihistamines are drugs that antagonize these effects by blocking or inhibiting histamine receptors or H receptors, and they are categorized as either H1 or H2, according to the type of H receptor targeted. H1 antihistamines are mostly used to treat allergic reactions and mast cell-mediated disorders. On the other hand, H2 antihistamines are indicated primarily for gastric reflux disease because they reduce the production of stomach acid by reversibly blocking the H2 histamine receptors in the parietal cells of the gastric mucosa. The H1 antihistamines subtype is further divided into two generations. First-generation H1 antihistamines have less central effects and are primarily used as anti-allergic drugs. On the contrary, second-generation H1 antihistamines are non-sedative or have mild sedative effect. First-generation H1 antihistamines includes diphenhydramine, meclizine, doxylamine, promethazine, clemastine, dimenhydrinate, brompheniramine, hydroxyzine, chlorpheniramine, dimetindene, and cyperheptadine. Second-generation H1 antihistamines includes loratadine, desloratadine, cetirizine, levocetirizine, azelastine, fexofenadine. Next are comprehensive systems of classification. They include anatomical therapeutic chemical or ATC classification system. It is most extensively used system. It merges classification by organ system and therapeutic, pharmacological, and chemical properties. We have previously talked about this system in detail. Systematized nomenclature of medicine clinical terms or SNOME-CT. It is a systematically organized, computer-processable compilation of medical terms giving codes, terms, synonyms, and definitions, utilized in clinical documentation and reporting. It incorporates a section allocated to drug classification. Medications in SNOME-CT can belong to multiple medication classes, as can the medication classes themselves. For example, medication classifications in the substance hierarchy for albuterol are listed as respiratory sympathomimetic agent, selective beta-2 adrenoceptor stimulant, ethanolamine. Adjacent to them is legal classification systems of drugs. The legal classification of drugs determines the level of control over its supply. In the US, there are only two legal classifications of drugs. These two classes are not prescription products and products which are prescription only. In UK, presently, there are three categories that a medicine can classified within. These are prescription-only medicine or POM, pharmacy or P, and general sales list or GSL. We have already debated over these classification systems in every aspect. In Canada, as classified by the National Food and Drugs Act, drugs are prescription and non-prescription pharmaceuticals, biologically derived products, like vaccines, blood-derived products, and products produced through biotechnology, tissues and organs, disinfectants and radiopharmaceuticals. Canada's national drug schedules have 3 schedules, or 4 categories, which are Schedule 1 drugs, Schedule 2 drugs, Schedule 3 drugs, and unscheduled drugs. We will learn them in succession. Schedule 1 drugs require a prescription for sale. They are provided to the public by a pharmacist following diagnosis and professional intervention. They are controlled in regulated environment as defined by provincial pharmacy legislation. Schedule 2 drugs do not require a prescription for sale. They are less strictly regulated than Schedule 1 drugs. They require professional intervention from a pharmacist at point of sale. Sometimes, they require a professional referral. They are available only from a pharmacist and must be stored where there is no public access or opportunity for patient self-selection. Schedule 3 drugs are available without a prescription. They may pose some risks in some self-selection situations. They are sold on store shelves under the direct supervision of the pharmacist, and they are subject to any local professional requirements that increase the degree of control in the professional service area. Unscheduled drugs can be sold without a professional supervision. They inform the consumer about making a safe and effective choice. They are labeled clearly with instructions for use. They are not included in Schedule 1, 2 or 3, and they may be sold from any retail outlet. Legal classification also includes pregnancy categories, which are described using an array of systems by various jurisdictions. Pregnancy categories have already been discussed in this video. Subsequent is American Hospital Formulary Service or AHFS, Pharmacologic Therapeutic Classification System. The AHFS system, for classifying drugs, is frequently used in North America. It is updated once a year and is published as a book by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. The AHFS code is a 6-digit number, which includes 3 levels of information arranged in a step-up or step-down manner. For instance, all AHFS codes, starting with 20, represent a broad class of drugs for blood formation and coagulation. Additional information is provided for subcategories of this class as digits are added. Example includes 2000 for blood formation and coagulation, 2004 for anti-anemia drugs, 2004.04 for iron preparations, 2004.08 for liver and stomach preparations. Certain drug classes have been amalgamated to meet practical needs. The class of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs is one such example. Precisely speaking, and also traditionally, the broader class of anti-inflammatory drugs also includes steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. These drugs were the major anti-inflammatories during the decade leading up to the introduction of the term nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Due to the catastrophic reputation that the corticosteroids had got in the 1950s, the brand new term, which was proposed to indicate that an anti-inflammatory drug was not a steroid, speedily gained acceptance. The drug class of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs is thus comprised of one component that is anti-inflammatory, which defines the mechanism of action, and one component that is nonsteroidal, which separates it from other drugs with that same mechanism of action. Likewise, one might say that the class of disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, that is, DMARDs, is composed of one element disease-modifying, which randomly specifies a mechanism of action, and one element anti-rheumatic drug that reveals its therapeutic use. And that wraps up our detailed overview of drug classifications. Remember, understanding drug categories helps us assess their potential benefits, risks, and appropriate usage. So, whether you are a healthcare professional, student, or simply curious about drugs, familiarizing yourself with these classifications is essential. In a nutshell, drug classification is an important component of pharmacy, since it gives a clear, concise information about the drugs and their classes. A discrepancy exists in the classification of drugs. It is therefore suggested that a uniform, universally acceptable method of classification of drugs must be adopted for better comprehension and recall. We hope you found this video informative. Stay tuned for future videos, diving deeper into each drug category and their specific drugs. If you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, please let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay informed and stay safe.